They said the most dangerous men never fell in love, but no one had ever warned Gabriel Romano about the sound of a lonely voice in the dark. Every evening, after the last security briefing ended and the echo of polished dress shoes faded through the marble halls of his estate overlooking the Hudson River, Gabriel found himself delaying the moment he returned to his private office. The mansion was silent in a way that expensive homes often were, filled with handcrafted furniture, priceless paintings, and rooms so large they seemed to swallow every human emotion. Wealth had bought him comfort, influence, and respect, but it had never managed to buy peace. At 38 years old, Gabriel carried the weight of leadership with calm discipline, yet the silence waiting for him every night had become heavier than any responsibility resting on his shoulders. Then, one rainy Thursday, everything changed. As he crossed the east hallway toward the library, a gentle humming floated through the air from behind the closed kitchen service door. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't meant for anyone to hear. It sounded like someone quietly comforting themselves after a long day, a melody warm enough to soften even the cold stone walls surrounding it. Gabriel stopped without realizing he had stopped. He listened until the humming faded into a soft voice speaking to herself while organizing dishes for the next morning. There was kindness inside every word, patience inside every breath, and a quiet strength that felt strangely familiar to a man who had forgotten what tenderness sounded like. The next evening he returned to the same hallway, telling himself it was coincidence. The evening after that, he came again. Soon it became the only part of his day he secretly anticipated. He never opened the door. He simply stood on the other side, listening to the mysterious maid speak softly while finishing her work long after everyone else had gone upstairs. Sometimes she read passages from old novels she borrowed from the mansion library. Sometimes she sang gentle church hymns her grandmother had taught her as a little girl in Georgia. Sometimes she whispered encouraging words to herself before another exhausting shift began. Gabriel never interrupted. For the first time in years, someone made him feel less alone without even knowing he existed just a few feet away. The staff eventually noticed their employer lingering near the service hallway more often, but no one dared question him. Meanwhile, Naomi Brooks believed the hallway remained empty every night. She had carefully chosen the late shift because fewer people meant fewer curious eyes. The kitchen door stayed closed for a reason, and so did the secret she carried every waking hour. She had learned long ago that some scars invited questions, and some questions reopened wounds that never truly healed. Behind that simple wooden door, hidden from the world, she allowed herself to become the woman she remembered before tragedy had rewritten her reflection. She smiled while she sang because no one could see her. She laughed quietly at the stories she read because no one could judge her face. She believed her voice was the only beautiful thing life had spared. What she never imagined was that every note, every whispered sentence, every fragile laugh was slowly becoming the heartbeat of the loneliest man in New York. And on the night Gabriel finally decided he had to thank the woman whose voice had unknowingly rescued his soul, fate prepared to break the promise neither of them had ever spoken aloud. Morning arrived with pale sunlight spilling across the mansion's tall windows, turning polished marble floors into sheets of gold. Yet Naomi Brooks still chose the narrow staff corridors where reflections never lingered. She had mastered every hidden route through the estate during her first month of work, memorizing service elevators, pantry doors, and quiet hallways where she could finish her responsibilities without becoming the center of anyone's attention. The other employees knew her as dependable, polite, and unusually private. They admired how she volunteered for late shifts and never complained about extra work, but no one understood why she politely declined invitations to birthday celebrations in the staff lounge or stepped away whenever someone reached for a group photograph. Naomi always smiled with genuine warmth before finding a graceful excuse to disappear. It was easier that way. People accepted silence more easily than uncomfortable curiosity. Every morning, she carefully tied a soft scarf around her neck before adjusting her neatly pressed uniform and checking that a few loose curls framed the side of her face. She never looked into the mirror for long. Instead, she focused on the day's schedule, reminding herself that honest work could build a peaceful future one quiet sunrise at a time. Across the mansion, Gabriel Romano discovered that his routine had begun changing in ways even he could not explain. Business meetings ended on time instead of stretching late into the evening. He canceled unnecessary social dinners. He spent fewer hours staring at financial reports after sunset because his attention constantly drifted toward the kitchen hallway where an unseen voice had become the brightest part of his day. His closest advisor noticed the difference immediately. Gabriel seemed calmer. His answers carried patience instead of sharp efficiency. He even thanked employees more often, leaving longtime staff exchanging puzzled glances after each interaction. They had never seen the reserved man smile to himself while walking alone through the house. Meanwhile, Naomi remained completely unaware of the quiet transformation happening just beyond the kitchen door. She believed the mansion became empty after 10 o'clock every night, allowing her to hum old melodies while polishing copper cookware or organizing shelves for the morning crew. Sometimes she imagined her late grandmother listening from heaven, reminding her that kindness could survive even when confidence disappeared. Those private conversations became the only moments when she allowed herself to sound carefree. One evening, while arranging fresh bread baskets for the following day, Naomi softly laughed after reading a humorous sentence from a worn library novel she had borrowed with permission. The laugh echoed gently through the service hallway, and Gabriel felt something unfamiliar settle inside his chest. He realized he could recognize her emotions without ever seeing her face. He knew when she sounded tired, when she sounded hopeful, and when she smiled simply by listening to the rhythm of her voice. That realization unsettled him more than any difficult negotiation ever had. He had built his life by trusting facts, evidence, and careful observation, yet now he found himself attached to someone he had never truly met. As the grandfather clock struck 11, Gabriel stepped closer to the wooden service door than ever before. His hand slowly lifted toward the polished brass handle before stopping only inches away. On the opposite side, Naomi gently whispered the same quiet promise she repeated every night before leaving. "Tomorrow will be another good day if nobody sees me." The following week settled into a rhythm that neither of them planned, yet neither of them wanted to break. Every evening, once the final members of the household retired upstairs and the enormous mansion surrendered to quiet, Gabriel found himself walking the same corridor with the same steady heartbeat. He never hurried anymore. The hallway had become a destination instead of a passage. Behind the familiar kitchen service door, Naomi carefully completed the last tasks of her shift, unaware that someone looked forward to the sound of every plate she stacked, every kettle she filled, and every gentle melody she absent-mindedly carried through the room. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the tall windows, Gabriel cleared his throat just loudly enough to announce his presence without opening the door. The humming stopped immediately. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Naomi smiled to herself, believing it was another member of the night staff passing by. "Good evening," she said softly through the closed door. Gabriel hesitated. It felt strangely easier to negotiate million-dollar agreements than to answer two simple words. Finally, he replied, "Good evening." Silence followed again, but this time it felt comfortable rather than awkward. Naomi returned to drying a row of crystal glasses while asking, "Could not sleep either?" Gabriel almost laughed. Nobody had spoken to him so casually in years. Everyone else carefully measured every sentence around him, but this unseen woman sounded as though she were talking to an ordinary neighbor across a backyard fence. "Not tonight," he admitted. "The house is too quiet." Naomi nodded, even though he could not see her. "Big houses can feel lonely. My grandmother used to say that a small apartment filled with laughter is warmer than a mansion filled with silence." Gabriel lowered his eyes toward the polished marble beneath his shoes. No business advisor had ever described his life so accurately in a single sentence. From that night forward, the conversations grew naturally. They never lasted long, sometimes only 5 minutes, sometimes 10, but they slowly became the favorite part of both their evenings. Naomi shared stories about recipes her grandmother had taught her, the tiny church where she learned to sing as a little girl, and the community library where she once dreamed of working because books never judged appearances. Gabriel found himself speaking about subjects he had never discussed with anyone else. He admitted that he often worked simply because work filled empty hours. He confessed that he had forgotten what it felt like to enjoy ordinary moments without checking the time. He even smiled while describing the old golden retriever he owned as a teenager before adulthood replaced simple joys with endless responsibility. Naomi listened carefully, offering quiet encouragement instead of advice. Somehow she always knew exactly when to speak, and when silence carried more comfort than words. Yet one rule never changed. The door remained closed. Whenever Gabriel casually suggested that he could thank her in person for their conversations, Naomi gently redirected the subject. She always sounded kind, never fearful, but there was unmistakable sadness beneath her calm voice. "Some people are better remembered by what they say than by what they look like," she whispered one evening. Gabriel rested his hand against the cool wooden door, feeling only solid oak between them. "I do not believe that," he answered honestly. On the opposite side, Naomi quietly closed her eyes before whispering a promise to herself that hurt a little more every night. No matter how safe his voice made her feel, she could never allow him to see the truth waiting behind the only door that still protected her heart. Autumn arrived quietly, painting the trees beyond the mansion in shades of amber and crimson, but inside the estate nothing changed except the growing anticipation that settled over Gabriel each evening. He no longer questioned why his feet carried him to the service hallway. It had become as natural as breathing. Every conversation through the closed kitchen door left him feeling lighter than the one before, and for the first time in many years he caught himself looking forward to tomorrow instead of simply enduring today. Naomi noticed the change in herself as well. She had begun smiling more often during the day, earning puzzled looks from the other housekeepers who had only ever known her as the gentle woman who worked quietly and kept to herself. They assumed she had received good news from family. None of them guessed that the happiest moments of her week happened while standing on opposite sides of an ordinary wooden door. One cool Thursday evening, Gabriel arrived carrying 2 cups of hot tea prepared exactly the way she had once mentioned her grandmother used to make it, with honey, lemon, and just enough cinnamon to warm the hands before warming the heart. He carefully placed 1 cup on the floor outside the door and softly knocked. Naomi opened the small service hatch near the bottom of the door, just enough to reach the cup without revealing herself. She paused in surprise before letting out a quiet laugh that instantly made Gabriel smile. "You remembered," she whispered. "You told me stories worth remembering," he answered. They stood there sharing tea while separated by only a few inches of polished oak, speaking about ordinary things that somehow felt extraordinary. They discussed the first snowfall they both hoped would arrive before Christmas, favorite childhood desserts, and the comforting smell of fresh bread rising before sunrise. Time seemed to lose its meaning whenever they talked. At last Gabriel gathered the courage that had been quietly growing inside him for weeks. "Naomi," he said gently, speaking her name aloud for the first time. She became very still behind the door. Hearing her own name in his calm voice felt strangely personal, almost fragile. "Yes," she replied. Gabriel rested one hand against the smooth wood between them. "Would you allow me to thank you properly? Just once. We have spoken for weeks. I would like to meet you face to face." Silence filled the hallway. It stretched so long that he feared he had made a mistake. When Naomi finally answered, her voice sounded softer than ever before. "Please do not ask me that." Gabriel frowned, confused rather than offended. "Have I done something wrong?" "No," she answered immediately. "You have been kinder than anyone deserves." He waited patiently. "Then why?" Another long silence followed. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the floor, her fingers tightening around the warm cup. For years she had carefully built invisible walls to protect herself from pity, surprise, and the uncomfortable expressions that always appeared the moment strangers saw her face. She had promised herself that no matter how lonely life became, she would never willingly watch admiration turn into sympathy again. Taking a slow breath, she finally whispered the words she had repeated countless times inside her own heart. "Because I need you to promise me something." Gabriel listened without interrupting. "Promise me that you will never try to see me. Let me remain only a voice." Some beautiful things survive because they are never asked to prove themselves. Gabriel closed his eyes as the weight of her request settled over him. Every instinct urged him to ask another question, yet something inside her trembling voice told him this promise mattered more than he could possibly understand. After several quiet seconds, He answered with complete sincerity. If keeping that promise means I do not lose these conversations, then I give you my word. Behind the closed door, a single tear slipped quietly down Naomi's cheek, because for the first time in many years someone had chosen her comfort over his own curiosity, and she silently prayed that fate would never force either of them to break the promise they had just made. 3. Peaceful weeks passed without either of them breaking the promise. Winter settled over New York, covering the gardens outside the mansion with a thin blanket of snow that reflected the soft glow of evening lights. Inside the estate, life continued with quiet precision until one Friday night, when the unexpected arrived without warning. A sudden power outage swept across the neighborhood just after 10 o'clock. The chandeliers faded into darkness, the kitchen lights disappeared, and the emergency backup system hesitated for several long seconds before activating. Naomi instinctively reached for a flashlight stored inside a cabinet, but as she hurried across the room, a stack of serving trays slipped from the counter and crashed onto the floor with a sharp metallic echo that traveled through the silent hallway. Gabriel heard the sound instantly. Without thinking, he rushed toward the kitchen service entrance. "Naomi," he called through the darkness. "Are you all right?" Before she could answer, another heavy pan rolled across the floor, followed by a startled gasp. Every promise vanished beneath a single moment of human concern. Gabriel turned the brass handle and pushed the door open. The emergency lights flickered to life at that exact second. Time seemed to stop. Naomi stood only a few feet away, frozen beside the scattered cookware. The flashlight had slipped from her hands, leaving one pale beam resting across the floor. Slowly she lifted her face toward the doorway. The left side of her face carried smooth, familiar features framed by gentle curls, while the right side revealed old scars that traced across her cheek and temple, quiet reminders of a fire that had long since ended but had never completely released her. The room became perfectly still. Gabriel did not speak. Naomi did not move. The silence between them felt endless. She had imagined this moment hundreds of times during sleepless nights, always expecting the same reaction. Surprise first, then discomfort, then polite sympathy wrapped in careful words. Her shoulders lowered as though preparing herself for another goodbye she had experienced too many times before. She quietly stepped backward and lowered her eyes. "I am sorry," she whispered with heartbreaking calm. "I tried to keep my promise. I never wanted you to see me like this." Gabriel remained standing near the doorway, unable to look away, not because of the scars, but because of the sorrow hidden behind her apology. He realized with painful clarity that she was apologizing for surviving something she had never deserved. Every conversation they had shared echoed through his mind. Every laugh, every gentle story, every comforting sentence. Nothing about the woman before him had changed except that he now understood how much courage it must have taken for her to trust him even from behind a closed door. Naomi forced herself to offer a small smile despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "Now you know why I asked you not to look." She bent down to collect the fallen trays before he could answer, hoping to escape before pity appeared in his expression. Instead, Gabriel slowly crossed the room and quietly knelt beside her without saying a single word. He picked up the nearest tray and placed it gently onto the counter. His hands never trembled. His eyes never turned away. The silence between them no longer belonged to fear. It belonged to a truth neither of them had expected, because in that quiet kitchen, Gabriel understood that the promise had not been broken by curiosity. It had been broken by fate, and somehow, the woman whose voice had already captured his heart now carried a story that reached even deeper than he had ever imagined. The emergency lights continued to cast a soft amber glow across the kitchen long after the electricity returned, yet neither of them seemed to notice. Naomi quietly finished placing the last serving tray back onto the shelf before taking a slow breath. She had spent years rehearsing explanations that she hoped she would never have to speak aloud, but standing before Gabriel, she realized there was no carefully prepared sentence capable of carrying the weight of the truth. She folded her hands together to keep them from trembling and offered him the same gentle smile that had hidden countless difficult memories. "It happened 12 years ago," she said softly. "I was 18. Gabriel remained silent, giving her the space to continue at her own pace. Naomi looked toward the snow drifting beyond the kitchen window instead of meeting his eyes. I was walking home after volunteering at the community library when I noticed smoke coming from a small house across the street. Neighbors were calling for help, but everyone was afraid to go inside because the smoke had become too heavy. Her voice never became dramatic. She spoke with quiet honesty, as though describing someone else's life instead of her own. Then I heard a little girl crying for her mother. Gabriel listened without moving. I did not think about being brave, Naomi continued. I only thought about how frightened she must have been. She closed her eyes for a brief moment before continuing. A firefighter reached us only moments later. The child was safe. I was safe too, but the heat had already changed my face forever. She touched her cheek almost absent-mindedly, not with shame, but with acceptance earned through many difficult years. The doctors did everything they could. They told me I was lucky to be alive, and they were right. I have always believed that. She smiled again, though sadness quietly lingered behind her eyes. The hardest part was not healing. The hardest part was watching people stop seeing me before they ever learned my name. Gabriel felt an unfamiliar heaviness settle inside his chest. Throughout his life, he had met people who admired appearances, status, and influence. Yet the woman standing before him had lost none of the kindness that had first reached him through a closed door. "Did you ever find out what happened to the little girl?" he asked gently. Naomi nodded. "Only that she survived and moved away with her family. I never learned their names. That was never important to me. Knowing she had another chance at life was enough." She gave a quiet laugh, though it carried more reflection than joy. "People always ask whether I regret that day. The answer has never changed. I would make the same choice again." Gabriel lowered his eyes for a moment, struggling to understand how someone who had endured so much disappointment could still speak with such peace. The mansion around them suddenly felt different, less like a monument to success and more like a place that had unknowingly sheltered extraordinary courage without ever recognizing it. Naomi picked up her coat from the nearby chair and paused beside the doorway. "Now you know my secret," she whispered. "I only wanted one place where people listened before they looked." Gabriel watched her with quiet admiration, realizing that the woman he believed he needed to protect had, in truth, been carrying a strength greater than anything wealth or power could ever purchase. Sleep never came to Gabriel that night. Long after the mansion had fallen silent and the city lights shimmered across the Hudson River, he remained seated beside the floor-to-ceiling windows in his study, replaying every conversation he and Naomi had shared through the closed kitchen door. Her laughter, once mysterious, now carried a deeper meaning. Her hesitation finally made sense. Every gentle refusal had never been about distrust. It had been an act of quiet self-protection. For the first time in many years, Gabriel questioned how many remarkable people the world had overlooked simply because it had judged them before listening to their stories. The following morning he arrived at breakfast earlier than usual, but Naomi was nowhere to be seen. She had asked another housekeeper to cover the main dining room while she completed inventory in the pantry below. She needed time. She feared that the kindness she had heard in Gabriel's voice the previous evening might slowly transform into sympathy, and sympathy had always been the beginning of distance. Throughout the day, she carefully avoided every hallway where their paths might cross, convincing herself that giving him space would make everything easier. Yet every quiet corner of the mansion reminded her of the conversations they had shared. Even the familiar scent of fresh coffee carried memories of evenings when they had laughed together without seeing one another. Gabriel noticed her absence immediately. He never asked anyone where she was. Instead, he respected the silence she had chosen, though each passing hour left an unexpected emptiness inside him. Late that afternoon, he wandered into the mansion library, searching for a business report he had no intention of reading. As he reached toward one of the upper shelves, a small hardcover novel slipped from its place and landed gently on the polished wood floor. Tucked inside its pages was a faded library checkout card with Naomi's neat handwriting. Beneath her signature, she had written a single sentence in blue ink. "Some stories become beautiful only after someone chooses to finish reading them." Gabriel stared at the words for several long moments before quietly closing the book against his chest. He suddenly understood why she loved stories so deeply. Books never looked at a face before discovering the heart hidden inside the pages. That evening, instead of waiting outside the kitchen door, Gabriel walked into the mansion garden where fresh snow rested untouched across the winding stone paths. A few minutes later, he noticed Naomi standing alone beneath the old oak tree near the greenhouse, watching tiny snowflakes drift through the evening air. She had not realized anyone else was outside. For a brief moment, he simply admired the peaceful way she tilted her face toward the sky, allowing winter to settle softly around her. There was no fear in that moment because she believed she was alone. Gabriel approached slowly, careful not to surprise her. When she turned and saw him, uncertainty immediately returned to her eyes. Before she could apologize or retreat, he gently held up the novel he had found. "I think you forgot this," he said with a warm smile. Naomi accepted the book, embarrassed. "I must have left it behind." Gabriel looked directly into her eyes with the same calm expression he had carried through every conversation behind the kitchen door. Nothing about his gaze suggested pity. Nothing suggested hesitation. "You once told me that some people are better remembered by what they say than by what they look like," he said quietly. "I believed that because of your voice. Now I believe something even greater. The strongest thing about you was never hidden by those scars. It has always been your heart." Naomi felt tears gather. Once more, but this time they came from a place she had almost forgotten existed. Hope. From that evening forward, something subtle but extraordinary began to change inside the Romano estate. Gabriel did not announce new rules or deliver dramatic speeches. Instead, he transformed the atmosphere through quiet actions that spoke louder than authority ever could. The first change came the following Monday morning when he instructed the household manager that every employee, regardless of position, would now join the monthly breakfast held in the grand dining room instead of eating separately in the staff quarters. No reserved tables. No invisible corners. Everyone belonged in the same room. The announcement surprised the entire household, but no one questioned it. Naomi hesitated before entering the dining room that morning. Years of keeping herself hidden made every step feel uncertain, yet when she quietly reached the doorway, Gabriel simply stood, smiled warmly, and pulled out an empty chair beside the long window overlooking the snow-covered gardens. He did not draw attention to her. He did not ask anyone to admire her courage. He simply treated her exactly as he treated every other person in the room. For Naomi, that simple gesture felt more valuable than every reassuring word she had ever heard. Over the following weeks, she slowly stopped choosing the hidden hallways whenever possible. She still carried herself with gentle humility, but she no longer lowered her eyes every time someone walked past. The other employees soon discovered what Gabriel had learned long before seeing her face. Naomi remembered birthdays without writing them down. She quietly prepared homemade soup whenever someone caught a cold. She left encouraging notes inside library books for coworkers who loved reading. Her kindness, once hidden behind closed doors, gradually filled every corner of the mansion. The conversations during dinner became warmer. Laughter returned to rooms that had once echoed with little more than polished footsteps. One snowy afternoon, Gabriel found Naomi organizing donated books into boxes destined for a neighborhood community center. "You are spending your day off working again," he teased gently. Naomi smiled as she carefully placed another novel into the carton. "Stories help me through difficult years. Maybe they will help someone else too." Gabriel looked around at the growing stacks of books before quietly picking up a marker and sitting beside her on the wooden floor. Together, they spent the afternoon writing handwritten messages inside the front cover of every donated book. Some messages simply wished the future reader happiness. Others encouraged courage, forgiveness, or hope. Hours passed without either of them noticing the fading daylight outside. It felt wonderfully ordinary, and perhaps that was what made the moment unforgettable. For the first time in years, Gabriel experienced an afternoon untouched by meetings, expectations, or endless responsibility. As they finished sealing the final box, Naomi looked toward him with quiet gratitude. "You never tried to change me," she said softly. Gabriel shook his head. "That was never my job." She looked down at her hands before asking the question that had quietly lived inside her heart since the night the kitchen door opened. "Then why did you stay?" Gabriel answered without hesitation. "Because I realized something important. The world spent too much time convincing you to hide your face. I would rather spend my life making sure you never feel the need to hide your heart again." Naomi felt warmth spread through her chest as snow continued falling outside the tall windows. She finally understood that acceptance was not found in pretending the scars did not exist. It was found in meeting someone who saw them, understood the story behind them, and still chose to remain exactly where they were. Spring arrived almost unnoticed, replacing the last traces of snow with fresh blossoms that lined the long driveway leading to the Romano estate. The mansion still stood with the same elegant stone walls and towering windows, yet those who worked there often whispered that the house somehow felt brighter than it used to. It was not because the chandeliers shined more brilliantly or because the gardens had become more beautiful. It was because laughter now traveled through rooms that had once known only silence. Naomi Brooks no longer searched for hidden hallways or lowered her eyes whenever footsteps approached. She greeted every employee by name, shared fresh bread she baked on quiet Sunday mornings, and continued filling borrowed library books with handwritten notes of encouragement before returning them to the community center. She never pretended her scars had disappeared. She simply stopped believing they were the first thing people deserved to notice. Gabriel watched that quiet transformation with deep gratitude. He had spent years believing strength meant carrying every burden alone. Yet the woman whose gentle voice had first reached him through a closed door had taught him that true strength often looked like kindness practiced every single day without expecting recognition. One warm afternoon, he invited Naomi to walk with him through the gardens where the old oak tree now stretched beneath bright green leaves instead of winter frost. The air carried the scent of blooming roses, and birdsong replaced the cold silence that had once surrounded the estate. They walked slowly without speaking for several minutes because neither of them felt the need to fill every quiet moment with words. At last, Gabriel stopped beside the small stone fountain where sunlight danced across the water. He looked at Naomi with the same calm eyes that had listened to her voice before ever seeing her face. "Do you remember the promise we made?" he asked gently. Naomi smiled. "The one about never opening the door?" He nodded. "I thought breaking that promise would cost me the happiest part of my life." She looked down for a brief moment before meeting his eyes again. "I believe the same thing." Gabriel took one careful step closer. "I thought I had fallen in love with a beautiful voice." Naomi's heartbeat quickened as she listened. "Then I met a woman whose courage was greater than her fear, whose kindness survived years of misunderstanding, and whose heart reminded me that dignity cannot be measured by appearance." His smile became softer than she had ever seen before. "I did not stay because I accepted your scars. I stayed because they were never the reason I admired you." Tears quietly filled Naomi's eyes, but this time they carried no sadness. They carried relief. Years of hiding, apologizing, and wondering whether anyone would ever truly see her had finally come to an end. She reached for his hand, and he gently held hers with quiet certainty. Around them the garden remained peaceful, as though the entire world had chosen not to interrupt that simple moment. Naomi looked toward the mansion where every conversation had begun behind a single closed door and softly laughed. "It is strange," she whispered. "The place where I tried hardest to disappear became the place where I was finally found." Gabriel smiled and answered with complete sincerity. "Your voice opened the door to my heart, but your soul is the reason it will always remain open." The evening sun settled gently across the gardens as they continued walking side by side, leaving behind a house that no longer echoed with loneliness, but with compassion, quiet hope, and the timeless reminder that the greatest beauty is never the face the world sees first, but the character that chooses kindness when no one is watching.